We have Red Dead Redemption, the first one, on PC on October 29th. It is absolutely official after being heavily leaked and rumored. But what do we know about this? I mean, if you freeze it, you can certainly tell that these are older character models. The game was originally an Xbox 360 level game, but if you go ahead and don't freeze it, kind of squint your eyes a little bit, the overall game certainly still has an attractive art style. However, again, it does not look to be any kind of full remake. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no advantages when compared with the console versions. If I go ahead and look at this, I found on the GTA forums somebody has at least taken one screenshot from the PC trailer that I was just showing you and lined it up with some console footage. Now, the console footage isn't the Xbox 360 original, it is the PS4 footage from the GTA series videos. Now, to be clear, the PS4 footage, this is in 2023, we got a PlayStation 4 version of the game, which then can also run in a PS5 kind of backwards compatibility to boost resolutions, frame rates. But again, those versions of the game didn't do a lot with the underlying graphics to improve the game. So when we look at things like the system requirements, we can also take into account that it's not just, at least on its maximum settings, matching the Xbox 360 game, right? There are some advantages to the PlayStation 4 version, and then also looks like especially the PC version. Looks like the biggest difference here, if we go ahead and zoom in, is if you look at this hill in the background, right? That's very flat grass, not a lot of detail, and if we scroll back here, you can see that there's way more visible actual 3D grass coming off the hill, a lot more foliage, all of that. So it seems like at least in terms of draw distance of details, the PC version will be able to push far beyond what consoles have been able to do, at least judging by this screenshot. It also appears to be a pretty different shadow appearance, although there is some difference in the character models here. But you guys see this like razor sharp outline of a shadow here on the door, and we're not seeing anything quite like that on this shot. Also, the shadowing inside the door definitely seems different. So it seems like, at least in terms of shadow detail, draw distances, and then of course resolution, the PC version will offer superior visuals. But again, as we go through here, if you freeze on like character faces and things like that, while again, the overall art style can look attractive, the characters themselves, still not highly detailed reworked models or anything like that, right? So it does show the limitations of the original footage. Now, we also have some advantages for the PC version in terms of like PC feature support. So, for example, we do have the latest version of DLSS with DLSS 3.7, and we also have AMD FSR 3.0. But notice it says 3.0 upscaling. It does not say frame generation, but it does say DLSS frame generation. So maybe the final version will include FSR frame generation, but that is absolutely not being confirmed here. Remember that FSR 3.0 has an upscaling component and a frame generation component, and a game can implement the upscaling component without the frame generation component. And again, it does specifically say upscaling when referencing FSR and DLSS, but then specifically calls out frame generation, but only for DLSS. Again, there are also more evidence that we'll have control of draw distances, saying adjustable draw distances, shadow quality settings. It does say and more, so it's possible that there's some other differences and things like that. It also looks like we will support up to native 4K resolution at it says up to 144 hertz on compatible hardware, which is really nice because the PlayStation 4 and even running on the 5 as versions, as far as I can tell, the 2023 version was locked to 30 frames per second when I looked into it most recently. So it's looking like the PC will run it at least unlocked up to 144 hertz frame rates. They're not saying fully unlocked though. But I think that 144 would be fine to enjoy the game. It's certainly much better than what you're getting on any console experience. It says the monitor support will go up to 21:9 and even 32:9 aspect ratio, as well as HDR10 support and full keyboard and mouse functionality. It also does include the Undead Nightmare version of the game. So there's a lot of good stuff here. And again, it does look like we can push things well beyond what consoles were able to do. Now, at what cost though, right? So let's jump a bit more into the actual PC system requirements. So first of all, this is not one of the better system requirements lists that we've ever seen. Nowadays, generally, companies for big releases will indicate at least a target frame rate and resolution and graphic settings to accompany their minimum and recommended specs, and oftentimes go well beyond that, offering 5 or 6 different configurations. We're not getting that here. Now, that being said, the minimum specs in most system requirements lists are targeting either 720p 30 at lowest settings or 1080p 30 at lowest settings. And sometimes they mention upscaling from 720p to 1080p at 30 frames per second lowest settings, either using DLSS or FSR. And again, we know the game does support DLSS or FSR. So that is potentially what the minimum settings are indicating performance-wise here, because that's seems to be the industry standard, but not every game follows that type of pattern. The recommended settings, again, do not announce what sort of resolution frame rate target they're going for here. But again, currently in most system requirements lists, because I cover a lot of them, the kind of standard seems to be 1080p 60 FPS at least medium and sometimes better graphics settings. That tends to be what we're seeing. Now, we could also compare this with Red Dead Redemption 2, which doesn't necessarily tell us anything, but, you know, it's at least something we could think about. So, for example, Red Dead Redemption 2 actually has a lower recommended GPU. Like the NVIDIA GPU recommended for Red Dead Redemption 2 is a GTX 1060. Whereas the recommended GPU for Red Dead Redemption 1 is an RTX 2070. But let's actually go ahead and take a look at how the 1060 performed in Red Dead Redemption 2. In Red Dead Redemption 2, I, a while back, did a comparison of a GTX 1060 up against an RX 6600, talking about, would this be a worthy upgrade? And in that context, I did test out Red Dead Redemption 2 using the game's built-in benchmark. And if we watch the overall frame rate right here for the GTX 1060 at max settings, the max settings are running around 30 frames per second. So if we're getting around 30 frames per second from those, again, that's the Red Dead Redemption 2 system requirements. Their recommended settings were certainly targeting max settings at 30 FPS 1080p, not 60 FPS. But does that mean that's what Red Dead Redemption 1 is doing? And also, with Red Dead Redemption 2, if you were willing to reduce graphics settings, the GTX 1060 could actually perform quite a bit better. Here, I'm looking at the hardware unboxed optimized settings at 1080p resolution. And now if we watch the frame rate counter, you'll notice that while we're not a locked 60 frames per second, we're hanging out in the vicinity of 60 frames per second at these hardware unboxed optimized settings, kind of jumping between 50 and 60 as we run through town. There's definitely some dips. It's not amazing. But that's what we were getting from the recommended settings in Red Dead Redemption 2. So if that's at all applicable to Red Dead Redemption 1, then perhaps they're actually maybe, I would say, again, just given what the graphics look like, I would say maybe the recommended settings for Red Dead Redemption 1 are actually talking about 60 FPS at more maximized settings rather than, if we're talking 1080p, rather than the Red Dead Redemption 2, which might have been, like I said, more like 30 FPS. Anyway, that's just some speculation, and it's interesting to look at the comparisons. If we look at the minimum specs, though, we're definitely in kind of a lower-end GPU for the minimums when we go ahead and take a look here. Well, actually, the minimums are a bit interesting here. How about we talk about that? So let's focus back in on the Red Dead Redemption 1 system requirements and look at the minimum GPU required, because they list a GTX 960 along with a Radeon R7 360. And that's a really interesting pairing, because if I jump into like the Tech Power Up relative performance chart and I set the R7 360 as the baseline, This is not asking for much at all. I mean, like, really, at all. We're talking in the vicinity of a GT 1030. We're talking some really old Radeons. Like, we're not talking the RX 5000 series, we're talking HD 5000 and 6000 series. But notice how far I have to scroll up to get to the GTX 960. Notice even a GTX 950 is significantly more powerful than the R7 360. Again, even a GTX 1050 is way more powerful here. The GTX 960, according to this relative performance chart, is more than double the performance of an R7 360. And of course, in different games, we can have different performance levels. It can fluctuate game by game. But the point is that these GPUs are worlds apart in terms of their expected performance, which makes this a bit of an odd choice to pair up in the system requirements list. The good news is, though, that the R7 360 is very old and weak by this point in time. Also, there is a version of this game running on a Nintendo Switch. So whether or not the PC version can scale down as low as the Nintendo Switch version does, who knows? But again, I would say that they're not asking for a whole heck of a lot here on the minimum specs. But of course, what resolution and frame rate is that hitting and at what settings? Question mark. Now, the CPUs are an i5-4670 and an AMD FX 9590. Again, these are pretty old hardware. The i5-4670 is a 4-core, 4-thread processor from back in 2013, so this is a full decade old. And the AMD FX 9590 is technically 8-core, 8-thread, but we don't need to get into the details anyway, and this is also from 2013. So we are talking, now this original, anyway, the point is it's 10 years ago. So asking for 10-year-old hardware for the CPUs, it's nothing too crazy. If we move up to the recommended settings, the CPUs jump to an i5-8500 and a Ryzen 5 3500X, which again isn't anything too crazy, but is certainly a lot newer. The i5-8500 is 6-core, 6 threads, mid-range i5 CPU coming from 2018, so 6 years ago, and the Ryzen 5 3500X is also 6-core, 6-thread, so again, mid-range chip, and this one coming from 2019, so 5 years ago. So the recommended settings certainly step it up a lot compared to the minimum, but in the CPUs, nothing's too crazy or anything like that. They do want 8 GB of RAM, no matter what settings that we're looking at here. And they do want a DX12 capable graphics card, they're stating here. Now, we also want, if we move up to the, actually, we can talk storage space, only 12 GB. Again, we're talking much lower resolution, textures and models compared to modern games. If we compare that to like Red Dead Redemption 2, that game's wanting 150 GB of available space. So certainly a massive step down in the storage space for sure. They do note SSD recommended though, probably if you're wanting to run at the highest frame rates, that can always help smooth things out and load times and everything. But of course, the original version of this game and PS4 version even are certainly not running on an SSD, so you're probably fine without one. Now, again, the GPUs recommended are an RTX 2070 and an RX 5700 XT. So there is a world of difference between even a GTX 960 and like a 2070, right? They did say 2070, right? Okay. So if we set the 960 as our baseline, which remember is twice as powerful as the AMD baseline, which was interesting. But even if we set this as the baseline, you might spot your GPU somewhere in here, but we'll scroll up, your 970s significantly more powerful than that baseline. Your 1060s significantly more powerful than that baseline. And then we're getting all the way up to, a 1070 is way more powerful, a 2060, we're talking like 2.7 times as powerful. Here we're hitting the 5700 XT, which is about 3 times as powerful as that baseline setting. And the 2070 is right here as well at about 3 times. And again, if we do set the 2070 as the baseline now, we can see that the 2070 and the 5700 XT, which are recommended here, are right in line with each other. So while there was a massive gap between the AMD and NVIDIA minimum spec GPUs, there is actually pretty much parity between the NVIDIA and AMD recommended GPUs. So that sounds a lot more in line with what you would expect. Now again, these are a pretty big step up from what was asked for on the Red Dead Redemption 2 specs, but like I said, it's possible that they mean something different by recommended here than what they mean here. They could be targeting higher, the max settings and higher frame rate compared to the 30 frames per second that they were roughly targeting on the Red Dead Redemption 2 targets. So the other speculation I could have regarding performance is that, again, even though there's definitely differences between the PC version and the PlayStation 4 version of the game, so the PC version could be targeting higher stuff here, we do have some information about how the PlayStation 4 version performs. And all my sources will be linked in the video description, by the way, but I'll mention that this Eurogamer article, which is also basically a Digital Foundry video, they're affiliated, does analyze the performance of the PlayStation 5, PS4 Pro, and base PS4 version. They do mention that the PlayStation 5 version does pretty much lock out at 4K resolution, and they couldn't find any instances of it dropping below that, and also seem to be using FSR2 not as an upscaler, but as an anti-aliasing technique. They also mentioned some minor differences, especially in shadows, between the original Xbox code and the PS5 version running. But then they also called out that the game was using 720p UI elements, and I'm wondering if they updated that for the PC version, or if the user interface will still be only 720p assets. That's a little bit of a concern I might have, and honestly, that's probably what I would expect, but I don't know. We could hope for better, but maybe expect to only get the 720p original UI assets. But again, they did say that it runs identically on the latest PlayStation console right down to 30 FPS output. So the PlayStation was running 4K 30 even on the PlayStation 5. As far as I'm reading this. So now we could then speculate a bit on that because the PlayStation 5 GPU isn't worlds apart from an RTX 2070. So that's kind of interesting. It's not identical, but like I said, it's not worlds apart here. The PlayStation 5 is a bit more powerful, though. It would be more in line. They don't have the 6700 on here, which would fit just a little bit more powerful than this. So this is kind of roughly the ballpark of a PS5 GPU if we want to kind of just roughly estimate ballpark performances. So the PS5 is a bit more powerful than their recommended spec on the PC, but not worlds apart, and the PlayStation 5 was running 4K 30. Usually if a GPU can handle 4K 30, it can handle 1440p 60. So that's kind of a bit of a speculation of what you might get out of this. However, that could be running at the not maximum settings, since the PC version seems to have settings that can push beyond what those console versions were running at. Anyway, I think with our limited information we have available here, I've given you all the details I possibly can, but I'm certainly interested in this release. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.